Methodological Framework for Development of Standards for Optical Diagnosis in Gastrointestinal Endoscopy, European Society of Gastrointestinal Endoscopy, ESGE Position Statement. Introduction. Optical diagnosis has an increasingly important role in current endoscopy practice because of the development of advanced imaging techniques and breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, AI. Accurate optical diagnosis is an important skill to guide clinical decisions in endoscopy. Correct prediction of the histology, i.e. optical diagnosis, will help in choosing the appropriate resection method and surveillance interval, thereby avoiding under and over treatment and saving costs. ESGE has developed a core curriculum for optical diagnosis practice across Europe for high-quality optical diagnosis training. The development of easy-to-measure competence standards that are focused on the clinical consequences of optical diagnosis could help to optimize clinical management in gastrointestinal endoscopy. Initial process. In 2020, the ESGE board established an expert-derived task force in order to develop a methodological framework for developing standards for optical diagnosis in gastrointestinal endoscopy. This task force is a spin-off of the Curricular Working Group for Optical Diagnosis Training. The aim of this position statement is to propose a methodological framework that can be used to define easy-to-measure competence standards for optical diagnosis that are focused on clinical consequences. Description of the methodological framework for the development of standards for optical diagnosis in gastrointestinal endoscopy. Step 1. Definition of the main categories of optical diagnosis and clinical consequences of optical diagnosis. For each topic, the main categories of optical diagnosis outcomes will be identified according to their clinical usefulness and current ability to predict the histology. In addition, the potential positive and negative consequences of performing optical diagnosis will be mapped. Step 2. Systematic review of the literature and/or simulation approach to assess the clinical consequences for different standards of optical diagnosis. In order to assess the potential clinical benefits or harms of implementing optical diagnosis with different standards, a systematic literature search will be performed or updated if available. When possible, and if needed, a simulation approach could be performed to quantify the expected benefit and harm related to different optical diagnostic competence standards. For diminutive colorectal polyps, a simulation approach has already been extensively described. Step 3. Delphi consensus procedure to reach consensus on standards for optical diagnosis. To establish safe and easy-to-measure standards for optical diagnosis, clinically acceptable consequences of implementing this standard need to be chosen. Therefore, a panel of European experts in optical diagnosis will be asked to participate in a minimum 3-round modified Delphi process to reach consensus on competence standards based on the literature search and, if available, a simulation model. All participating experts will be asked to vote online on the potential options for competence standards for optical diagnosis. For each competence standard option, the evidence in the literature about the potential clinical benefits or harms of implementing optical diagnosis will be shown. If available, the clinical consequences, as estimated by a simulation study, will also be shown. For a standard to be accepted, at least 10 experts have to vote on these options. The standards with consensus will form the new competence standards for optical diagnosis. A standard will be accepted if at least 80% agreement is reached after a minimum of 2 voting rounds. Participating experts will be asked to rate their agreement using a 5-point Likert scale: strongly agree, agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, strongly disagree. Experts agree on the standard if they vote strongly agree or agree. Standards will be adapted and/or excluded during iterative rounds of discussion of the comments and suggestions made by the experts during the modified Delphi process. If there is extensive discussion and if there are changes to or adaptation of a statement, a new Delphi round will be initiated to test the consensus on the specific statement. The evolution and adaptation of the minimum standards during the Delphi process will be documented. Experts will be asked to leave a comment if they are undecided or disagree on a specific standard. At the end, an open text box is provided for participants to include comments relating to items if desired. The final results will be circulated to all experts for review and comment. Conclusion and future prospects. This ESGE position statement provides a clear and comprehensive methodological framework That can be used for the development of standards for optical diagnosis in gastrointestinal endoscopy. The optical diagnosis standards that will be produced in the coming years will be a first step in optimizing treatment and surveillance interval decisions. After finalization of the development of competence standards, prospective evaluation of these standards will be necessary. Eventually, incorporating these standards into ESGE certification for optical diagnosis training could be the ultimate objective.